For decades, Iran sat at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz and basically told the world one thing with absolute conviction. This narrow stretch of water is our ultimate trump card. The logic was simple, right? If you close the strait, the global economy chokes, and everyone comes crawling to Tehran just to survive. It was essentially the most powerful geographic weapon in modern history. But, as we're going to see in this explainer, when they finally decided to play that card in early 2026, they made a massive miscalculation. Today, we're putting on our regional analyst hats to evaluate how this single move permanently altered the Middle East, alienated former neutral states, and completely reshaped global energy. To really grasp the stakes here, we have to look at the immediate absolute panic when the Strait of Hormuz was abruptly shut down in February 2026. The impact was instantaneous. Shipping firms suspended operations, war risk insurance vanished, and oil prices went screaming past $100 a barrel as the entire market braced for an unprecedented shock. And here's why the panic was so severe. Just look at the sheer scale of what we're talking about. This single 39-kilometer-wide waterway handled 34% of all global crude oil trade. That's a massive chunk of the pie. It was quite literally the on-off switch for the world economy. The international community honestly had no playbook for what happens when a third of the world's crude oil suddenly stops moving. So to make sense of this geopolitical earthquake, here's our strategic briefing outline. We are going to quickly cover the Hormuz trump card, the 2026 energy shock, the pipeline counterpunch, the death of neutrality, and finally, bypassing geography forever. Okay, starting with Section 1, the Hormuz trump card and decades of deterrence. For 40 years, Iran's entire deterrence architecture rested on an unshakable threat. Think about the volume here. 20 million barrels of oil and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas passing through every single day. The underlying logic was stark. If you control that flow, you hold the leverage. The threat of turning off that tap was historically enough to keep any adversary at bay. Moving to Section 2, the 2026 energy shock and triggering the trap. The fatal flaw in Iran's whole strategy was unleashed the moment they actually pulled the trigger. Following strikes by the US and Israel on February 28, 2026, the IRGC immediately closed the strait. We're talking about a collapse of more than 90% of maritime traffic, essentially erasing up to 20 million barrels from global markets overnight. But, and this is crucial, pay close attention to March 2026 on this timeline, because that is exactly when the Gulf nations flipped the script. It's exactly why the Defense Horizon Journal called this potentially the largest single energy disruption in modern history. The entire world was suddenly staring down a catastrophic energy crisis, desperately scrambling to figure out if there was any alternative route to keep the lights on. Which brings us to Section 3, the pipeline counterpunch and unlocking the valves. The solution came directly from the Gulf states. They had spent years quietly preparing massive infrastructure workarounds for this exact nightmare scenario, and the contrast here is absolutely staggering. Saudi Arabia utilized its massive petrol line, pushing a record 7 million barrels a day straight to the Red Sea. The UAE pumped 1.8 million barrels directly to the open ocean via their ADCOP pipeline. Meanwhile, Iran's own bypass pipeline, the Gura-Jask project, it was barely operational, pushing out just 0.3 million barrels per day. And that reveals the massive irony here. By closing the strait, Iran closed a waterway that they also desperately needed. They essentially locked themselves inside their own house, all while their neighbors were already calmly using the back exit. This staggering miscalculation proved to the world that the global economy actually could function, even if it was painful, without Tehran's permission. Let's dive into Section 4, the death of neutrality, from ambiguity to adversary. Now, it wasn't just the pipelines that reshaped the region. It was the physical retaliation that completely fractured the Gulf Cooperation Council's diplomatic soul. Before 2026, nations like the UAE maintained the stance of studied ambiguity, balancing trade, acting as diplomatic bridges, trying to keep everyone happy. But post-2026, everything changed. The UAE closed its embassy, officially labeled Iran a declared enemy, and actively urged the US to forcefully seize Iranian-held islands in the strait. The era of neutrality was dead, as these nations realized they had to prioritize long-term energy security over any lingering hopes for peaceful relations with Iran. And to understand why a state like the UAE shifted so drastically, just look at these raw numbers. Iranian aggression was completely unhinged. They hammered the Emirates with 174 ballistic missiles and tracked nearly 700 drones. They hit Dubai International Airport. They forced a massive ADNOC refinery to shut down, losing 922,000 barrels a day. And ironically, they directly targeted the exact Fujairah port infrastructure the UAE needed to bypass the strait in the first place. All told, the GCC faced a whopping 83% of Iran's total missile and drone strikes during the conflict. Think about that for a second. By bombarding their former neutral neighbors, instead of just the nations that originally struck them, Iran completely shattered the Gulf's perception as a safe haven. They violently alienated these states, converting them from diplomatic bridges into viscerally motivated opponents who now wanted Iranian leverage dismantled permanently. Which leads us perfectly into Section 5, bypassing geography forever. So for decades, the deterrence architecture of the Gulf was built on one big assumption, that the economic interdependence surrounding the Strait of Hormuz made closing it completely unthinkable. But the moment Iran broke that rule and actually did the unthinkable, that trust was gone forever. Every Gulf state and every major Asian importer suddenly realized they could never rely on Iranian goodwill again. And that realization is driving some incredibly ambitious new investments. Take the 116-kilometer UAE corridor concept. We're talking about a proposed cross-peninsula pipeline or even a full-blown canal connecting the Persian Gulf Strait to the Gulf of Oman. The whole point here is to transform the Strait of Hormuz from a binary on-off switch into just one route among many. It raises a really fascinating question for regional analysts. Can nations literally build their way around a natural geographic choke point? Well, as we're seeing, when you hold the entire global economy hostage, you give the world the ultimate financial motivation to figure it out. I think this quote sums up the new reality perfectly. For every barrel that exits through Fujairah rather than the strait, Iran's most powerful deterrent is directly eroded. Iran closed the strait to prove they were absolutely indispensable. But all they really did was accelerate a massive, highly motivated international coalition actively working to make them dispensable. The Strait of Hormuz route is being systematically bypassed by a region that absolutely refuses to be held hostage ever again. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. As we look at this brand new map of global energy and diplomacy, do you think geographic choke points like Hormuz will ever regain their ultimate power, or has modern infrastructure ended that era for good? Think about it. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.